Rome did not always need legions to change history. They sometimes relied on criminals. A single street gang could silence a senator, break an election, or even burn down the Senate house itself. That shocking reality shaped the final years of the Roman Republic more than most people realize. Rome is often remembered as a place of laws, order, and military discipline, yet in its crowded neighborhoods and chaotic forums, another force emerged. This hidden world of mob leaders, hired muscle, and political violence operated in plain sight and influenced decisions at the highest levels. Understanding how these crime networks worked reveals a side of Rome that is rarely discussed, but absolutely essential to understanding how the Republic unraveled. The capital in the 1st century BC was bursting with people. Citizens, freedmen, and migrants from across the Mediterranean packed into towering insulae that creaked with age. Crowds poured through the forum every day to vote, listen to speeches, receive grain, or follow their favorite politicians. This density created opportunity for those bold enough to exploit it. Some discovered that controlling groups of desperate men could be more effective than delivering a carefully crafted argument in the Senate. As political competition intensified, street leaders realized their influence could be traded for protection, money, and access. By the time famous figures like Cicero and Julius Caesar were rising, Rome was already becoming a battleground between gangs, with loyalties that shifted according to the highest bidder. That environment set the stage for one of the most notorious gang leaders Rome ever produced. Before we continue, make sure to smash both the like and hype buttons and subscribe to our channel for more ominous history videos. We greatly appreciate your support. Roman street gangs. The world of Roman street gangs began in the alleys near the Forum and the slums of the Subura, where young men formed groups for protection, gambling, and ambition. These gangs became more organized as Rome grew more unstable. Some were tied to taverns, others to neighborhoods, and a few became private armies serving ambitious politicians. Their members were often men with little to lose, living in overcrowded districts and struggling to find stable work. They realized that their physical presence had value because the streets were the real heart of Roman politics. If they blocked a road, no election could proceed. If they silenced a speaker, a law could not be passed. Their actions were felt immediately, giving them a kind of influence far beyond their social standing. In many ways, these street groups filled gaps in Rome's government. There was no professional police force in the Republic, and magistrates relied on lictors who were insufficient to manage huge crowds. Gangs stepped into that vacuum by offering control at a price. They intimidated rivals, protected allies, and created an atmosphere in which political ideas mattered less than brute strength. As these groups grew more confident, several leaders rose to prominence, proving that the man who ruled the streets could challenge even the elite. Among them, Publius Clodius Pulcher became the most feared name in Rome. Publius Clodius Pulcher. Clodius recognized earlier than anyone that Rome's urban poor were a sleeping giant. He cultivated loyalty in districts that wealthier politicians ignored. His transformation from a disgraced aristocrat into a champion of the masses shocked his rivals. To maintain power, he organized large groups of followers who acted as his personal syndicate. These men accompanied him wherever he went, ensuring that his voice dominated public meetings. Clodius built his base near the Forum and the Subura, where poverty and overcrowding created fertile ground for unrest. The loyalty he commanded allowed him to pressure magistrates, disrupt trials, and influence legislation. His control of the gangs became infamous during his rivalry with Cicero. When Clodius targeted him, the atmosphere in Rome turned hostile. Supporters of Cicero feared to appear in public, while Clodius used his growing syndicate to fill the city with agitation. His reforms that lowered the price of grain and expanded citizenship rights won him further backing. Yet beneath these populist measures lay a system of intimidation. His men harassed opponents, shut down assemblies, and ensured that no one questioned their leader without consequence. Clodius showed Rome that a single gang leader, if charismatic and ruthless, could reshape the political landscape entirely. Titus Annius Milo. If Clodius dominated the streets through popularity, Titus Annius Milo countered him through sheer force. Milo was backed by conservative senators who believed he could stand against Clodius's influence. He created his own syndicate of street fighters who clashed repeatedly with Clodius's men. Their confrontations became legendary as the two forces battled in the Forum, on the Sacred Way, and near the entrances to voting assemblies. Every appearance by either leader risked turning into a riot, and even high-ranking officials hesitated to intervene. One of the most dramatic moments in Roman history unfolded when the two rivals met unexpectedly on the Via Appia. The encounter escalated rapidly, and Clodius was killed. His death ignited chaos in the capital. Milo's supporters claimed self-defense, while Clodius's followers carried his body into the Senate house during their grief. What happened next stunned the city. In the uproar, they set the building ablaze, transforming a political rivalry into a full-scale urban meltdown. Milo was eventually charged and exiled, demonstrating how quickly raw street power could spiral out of control. His rise and fall revealed the dangerous volatility inherent in using gangs as political tools. Gangs of the Subura. The Subura served as the engine behind much of Rome's criminal life. Its dense housing, constant noise, and unending flow of migrants created a setting where authority was fluid. Young men from this district often became the backbone of Rome's gangs. They were familiar with the crowded alleys, skilled at moving through congested streets, and accustomed to conflict. Some leaders, including Mark Antony in his youth, became connected to Subura groups that shaped their early reputations. Although not every resident was involved in crime, the district produced many of the foot soldiers who joined larger syndicates. The Subura's gangs offered protection in a place where official structures failed to provide security. They controlled gambling operations, guarded taverns, and mediated disputes. Their influence extended beyond crime because politicians valued their loyalty. During tense elections or controversial public speeches, these groups could determine whether a message reached the crowd or was drowned out by violence. The Subura gained a reputation as a crucible of ambition where political and criminal activity merged. Its gangs became a symbol of how deeply street-level power could shape the broader world of Roman politics. Political violence in Rome. The late Republic became a stage where political violence determined outcomes that should have rested on debate. Elections were especially vulnerable. The comitia, where citizens gathered to vote, often became battlegrounds as gangs attempted to control entry points and intimidate rivals. Events in the mid-1st century BC demonstrate how widespread these tactics became. Cicero, Pompey, and even Julius Caesar witnessed or endured disruptions that forced them to adapt to the new reality. Rome's political class increasingly relied on private gangs to guarantee safety during public events. This violence had long-term consequences. It bred mistrust between factions and encouraged a belief that the legal system was unable to protect its own citizens. As threats increased, politicians escalated their tactics. Public speeches required armed escorts, and the idea of open debate eroded. Many ordinary Romans became disillusioned, wondering whether their votes mattered or whether powerful men had already decided outcomes behind the scenes. The reliance on street power deepened the fractures within the Republic and set the stage for an environment where mob control seemed stronger than constitutional authority. Gang warfare at the Forum. No location in Rome reflected this transformation more clearly than the Forum. The grand center of public life became a place where gangs confronted one another with little restraint. Meetings on the rostra were frequently interrupted by shouts, stones, and organized chaos. Violence near the Curia Hostilia became so common that senators feared walking to sessions without armed escorts. The Temple of Castor and Pollux, normally a site of prestige, became a vantage point for rival groups trying to dominate the crowds. The most symbolic moment occurred after Clodius's death when his supporters carried his body into the Senate house. In their grief and fury, they set the building on fire, destroying the heart of the Republic's political world. The blaze represented more than spontaneous emotion. It revealed how far gang influence had penetrated Rome. The Forum, once a symbol of civic order, now reflected the Republic's instability. These events made clear that the balance of power was shifting, and that the institutions designed to maintain peace could no longer do so effectively. The Gladiator Gangs. Another disturbing development in this era was the rise of gladiator gangs. Wealthy Romans realized that gladiators were skilled fighters who could be used as private enforcers. Figures such as Julius Caesar, Crassus, and Clodius maintained groups of trained men who could intimidate opponents and protect their interests. Although gladiators were legally supposed to remain within the confines of their schools, the political demands of the time blurred these boundaries. Their presence increased tension wherever they appeared. The Senate attempted to limit the number of gladiators allowed in Rome after violent incidents created fear among the public. Yet the restrictions came too late. Gladiator gangs had already demonstrated how easily private wealth could be converted into street power. Their involvement deepened the sense of crisis by showing that Rome's most dangerous fighters were no longer confined to arenas, but now operated in the heart of political life. Their participation marked a turning point in the blending of entertainment, violence, and politics. Pompey's crackdown on crime. The crisis reached a point where even seasoned senators admitted they no longer understood how to control their own capital. That vacuum of authority pushed them to grant Pompey the Great extraordinary responsibility to restore order, a decision rooted in the belief that his reputation alone might intimidate the street factions into backing down. Pompey quickly realized that the violence was not the work of a few individuals, but the product of well-organized networks with leaders, meeting places, and financial backers. To confront this, he introduced urban cohorts whose sole purpose was to keep watch over the city. They were stationed near the Forum, the Subura, and the Via Appia, where gang activity was strongest. Their presence signaled a new seriousness, because Rome had never before placed dedicated forces within its own streets rather than on its frontiers. Pompey's investigation into the killing of Clodius revealed how complicated the situation had become. Rival factions attempted to manipulate witness statements, and armed groups attempted to sway public opinion by gathering around courts. He pursued associates of Milo, seized weapons stockpiles hidden in taverns, and raided homes suspected of harboring gang leaders. These raids uncovered evidence of money transfers, coded messages, and other tools typical of criminal organizations. His efforts convinced many that the Republic had ignored the growth of these networks for too long. Although the immediate violence diminished, the underlying problem remained visible. The city returned to an uneasy calm, reminding citizens that their government was struggling to maintain its authority in the heart of its own empire. Pompey's methods hinted at a future Rome where order would come from command rather than collaboration. He brought soldiers into public life in ways that had not been seen before, and many Romans wondered whether this approach would permanently change the balance between civilian and military power. While he succeeded in reducing the most visible violence, he could not dismantle the culture that produced these gangs. The Republic was showing signs of fatigue, relying on a single individual rather than its established institutions to preserve stability. Rome stood at a crossroads where traditional governance was faltering, and the solutions being attempted increasingly resembled the centralized control that would later define the empire. Julius Caesar and urban control. When Julius Caesar emerged as the central figure in Roman politics, he inherited a city still marked by the scars of gang rule. He had observed the chaos during his earlier career and recognized that Rome could not function while street groups remained powerful. Caesar approached the crisis differently than Pompey. Instead of relying only on force, he examined the social structures that allowed gangs to thrive. The collegia, which were supposed to be trade and social associations, had become shelters for violent groups. Caesar dissolved many of these organizations and reformed the others so that they were no longer vehicles for intimidation. His changes targeted the roots of the problem rather than its symptoms, revealing his understanding that urban order required more than occasional crackdowns. Caesar also focused on reshaping the physical landscape of the city. The Forum had become a predictable arena for clashes, partly because it offered open space for large crowds to gather quickly. By initiating new building projects, he altered traffic flow, forced the relocation of certain meeting spots, and introduced structures that limited the ability of gangs to move freely. These urban reforms created a more controlled environment, reducing opportunities for sudden eruptions of violence. Caesar intended these changes to influence behavior as much as aesthetics, showing that architecture could function as a form of governance. Romans who visited the Forum after these changes often remarked that it felt more orderly, a sign that his reforms were beginning to shift public life. Despite his efforts to calm the streets, Caesar understood the importance of popular support. He had long built his reputation on the enthusiasm of crowds, yet he balanced this with legislation designed to prevent those same crowds from becoming weapons. His decisions created the basis for later emperors who would establish a professional police presence and permanent administrative offices dedicated to public safety. Caesar's reforms marked a turning point, demonstrating that Rome needed structured systems rather than improvised responses. His approach signaled the beginning of a new era in which urban control became a central priority of Roman leadership. The Republic was fading, and the measures he introduced revealed how the city was preparing for a different kind of stability that would soon define its imperial future. Fall of the Republic. The dominance of gang leaders in Rome contributed significantly to the downfall of the Republic. Years of violence eroded trust in elections, the courts, and public debate. When Augustus eventually took control, he established the first organized police and fire brigades, recognizing that order required permanent institutions rather than improvisation. The disappearance of gang warfare marked a dramatic transition from the instability of the late Republic to the more controlled environment of the early empire. These events reveal that Rome's political collapse was not caused solely by ambitious generals or philosophical disagreements. It was shaped by the thousands of ordinary men who fought in the streets, followed powerful leaders, and influenced decisions through sheer presence. Their story is often overshadowed by the grand narratives of battles and alliances, yet it holds a crucial key to understanding how Rome transformed. The rise and fall of these syndicates offers a reminder that even the greatest civilizations can fracture when the streets become more powerful than the state itself. If you made it this far, thanks for watching, and make sure to smash both the like and hype buttons and subscribe to our channel for more ominous history videos. We greatly appreciate your support. See you in the next video.